All right, you've been looking live here from Washington, D.C. at the state funeral at the National Cathedral honoring President Jimmy Carter. I'm joined here by Brenda Wood and Jeff Hollinger. What a beautiful service we've seen.
Absolutely magnificent, and you know, it matched the setting here, that majestic cathedral, the National Cathedral that has seen many presidential funerals, has taken part in ceremonies associated with the inauguration. So many historical touchstones and milestones that have been just serviced by the National Cathedral. And there you're looking at the end of what was just a poignant, thought-provoking, moving service in honor of President Carter.
It was so moving. The words were emotional. They moved all of us. And the pictures that we saw were also equally stunning. The pictures that we saw of President-elect Trump coming in, shaking hands with Mike Pence.
Sitting next to Barack Obama, and the exchange of so many smiles and laughter between the two of them.
And the Clintons' arrival, not making any eye contact toward the Trumps.
The Bush's arrivals, didn't
very little acknowledgement there as well.
Shaking the hand.
But this sort of choreography of presidents, ex-presidents, president-elect made for some certainly curious theater today.
Lots of people want to know. Wish they could be just a fly on the pew there. Well, to hear how the conversations unfolded between all of them. It's very interesting. You have to know that you realize that they realize that the cameras are pointed at them. Politics doesn't stop apparently at the cathedral door. They were all there, unified in memoriam to this great president, and so they were on their best behavior. Let's put it that way.
I thought the eulogy of Ambassador Andrew Young was, you would expect nothing less from him. It was extraordinary. Here he is speaking from his heart. He's 92 years of age, and he is speaking of Jimmy Carter as a contemporary and a blessing from God. And from there, the eulogy was a celebration of Jimmy Carter's heartbeat.
Yeah, he called him something of a miracle. He said the word miracle, I think, a couple times when referring to Jimmy Carter, talking about the contrast in their lives growing up. Two people in the Deep South with very different lives, different backgrounds, but found this common ground that really became something really special.
And you know what, that really is a hallmark of Jimmy Carter, who was able to synthesize and put all of that together in how he conducted his life. He came from a divided South. And he, of course, knew the history. He knew his life was very different from the lives of Black Americans in the South. And somehow he was able to bring all of that together in how he valued his life, how he lived out his life, and just put all of those things into his heart and created this one viewpoint from which he operated, which is that all people are created equal, no matter where they come from, no matter their background, no matter how they got from point A to point B, that we all are deserving of respect, and respect and honor and good deeds between each other.
And this table of Jimmy Carter was set by his mother, Lillian, who he described oftentimes. Sumter County has always been majority African American, and he knew what it was like to be a minority in that environment. And Miss Lillian was one who operated in the midst of racial segregation in the South, but it did not define her and her interactions with Black people.
Which made them a standout, I think, for many in the Sumter County area, in all of South Georgia, especially.
That's right. Right now we want to get live to 11 Alive anchor Cheryl Preheim. Cheryl, you're out there outside the cathedral as we are all watching the president's casket that's going to be brought out before the motorcade leaves heading back to Maryland. Tell us what you're seeing out there right now.
We see all of the grandchildren coming out of the church. You see them lined up here as they bring the casket down the steps. They are the honorary pallbearers. We're going to take a moment and just watch silently as they take President Carter's casket to the hearse. casket of the 39th President of the United States now in the hearse as that row of his grandchildren, the honorary pallbearers, look on, flanked by members of all the military branches. Those flags in the wind as service members are holding on tightly on a very gusty, cold day here in the nation's capital. But somehow such beauty in the flags waving in the wind as people watch the door close to the hearse one final time here in front of the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. The end of the services for President Jimmy Carter as the motorcade will now travel to Joint Base Andrews, where he will make his final trip home to the state of Georgia. As people here were watching the service, many tears, some laughter too, in those touching personal tributes we heard from both Joshua and Jason Carter, grandsons. A beautiful way to tie in the humanity of the man who sat in the Oval Office for 4 years, and as Jason pointed out, spent 92 other years centered and rooted in the state of Georgia as the family makes its way to the vehicles that will follow the barricade. It was notable just to see the emotion in the family after a remarkable week plus of tributes to an incredible man, starting in Plains, of course, and fittingly starting in Plains. Then they traveled alongside him to the Carter Center, where 23,000 people stopped by to pay their respects. Then traveling here to Washington, D.C., the family had a private moment in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda with President Carter as well. And it is both impactful and certainly exhausting as they say goodbye in such a public way to someone they knew in the most intimate way as only family can. So they will make that trip back to the private service in Georgia as well at Maranatha Baptist Church.
Cheryl, I want to jump in here.
It was really something. Yes, yes.
Yeah, I want to jump in here and
Please.
just make note of how poignant and moving it was to hear the recounting of Jimmy Carter's accomplishments and the love that he had with his staff members, his friends, people who were across the political aisle, and yet he, still forged very close friendships with Gerald Ford's son, who gave a eulogy for his father.
That was a great eulogy, wasn't it?
It was a terrific
really moving,
eulogy,
really
very,
unique,
very
too.
moving, and really underscored how close those two men were, in spite of the fact that they had waged such a tough political battle against each other during the presidential campaigns.
And their friendship began on the trip to Egypt. Richard Nixon was on the flight as well
funeral.
For this, the funeral, and when they came back, they discovered they had so much in common. They had a certain commonality of the United States and of spirituality and raising families, and quite frankly, they just liked each other.
They did indeed, and their families became good friends. As it turned out, President Carter did the eulogy for Gerald Ford. And now full circle moment where Gerald Ford's son was able to fulfill the promise that those two men made to each other.
I watched the eulogy that President Carter gave in 2007 for Gerald Ford this morning, and I was struck by how it mirrored what President Ford had written for his son Steve to read. That they were very similar in terms of what they had to say about each other. And I was struck by President Carter saying that he was always sad, and they both shared this view, that they were always sad that when their journeys, whether it was on a plane or in a vehicle, when they were going somewhere together, that it came to an end, because they had so much more to say to each other, so many laughs to have, and so much wisdom to share.
Bipartisan friendship is what we're talking about here, and it's almost, you wonder if it's possible in today's climate politically, if that kind of friendship between two people who really saw the world from very different points of view legislatively and with policy, that they were able still to find common ground because of their values.
We saw President Trump and former President Obama, President-elect Trump and former President Obama certainly sitting next to each other, interacting, which has gotten a lot of attention on X at this hour. It is a common discussed scene that we saw today that everybody's talking about.
I think largely because there's such a divide in this country.
Yeah.
Like we're wondering,
the rhetoric
how is
rough.
that even
it's
possible?
Tough. I mean, it's really
How
tough
is it
on both
possible?
sides. You know?
But it is possible. I think these politicians on this level of politics, they understand that is one thing. It's a job. One part of it is a job, and then there's another part where we're just people. And so maybe that's what we saw playing out today as we looked at all of those living presidents and vice presidents and their spouses sitting there together, paying homage to this great man. It's really telling. All of the things that were talked about, the friendships, the bipartisan across the aisle accomplishments, all of his accomplishments over the decades. And still we're talking about a man who served just one term in office. He lived a large life, and it didn't matter whether he was in the White House or not. He was still there to make a difference.
I think that illustrates as much as anything the great complexity of Jimmy Carter. I mean, there's so many moving parts to Jimmy Carter. Even looking at interviews, I've been looking at some 60 Minutes pieces that Mike Wallace did with him in 1985.
He was not a fan of Mike Wallace.
And those two had some very strong interactions, as you allude, but a very different Jimmy Carter in 1985, along with Rosalynn, where they were talking to 60 Minutes. They still weren't totally focused on what they were going to become in the post-presidency, but very spirited, very hard comments about Ronald Reagan and Ted Kennedy.
So Cheryl Preheim is there again in Washington outside the cathedral. Cheryl, we're all watching as the hearse is now leaving the cathedral.
Yes, the hearse just pulled out from the cathedral, making its way to Joint Base Andrews now, followed by these big vehicles you're seeing are full of the immediate family and closest friends. That motorcade will be greeted, of course, the public invited to line the street. And from my vantage point, about a half a block away, indeed, I see people bundled up in the cold get a final chance to say goodbye as the motorcade makes its final trip out of Washington, D.C. before heading back home to Georgia. You all were talking about some of the messaging during the service, and I thought it was really poignant as we talk about a president who was known to bring people together in his time in the White House and in all the decades since, and it felt as though some of those messages might be directed to some of the people in the room. Let's pause as the honor guard moves forward out of the church. The blue sky against the National Cathedral is quite striking as the conclusion here to the ceremony and the services of the funeral of the 39th President of the United States, Jimmy Carter. And what a remarkable service it was, starting off Joshua Carter, who started off with a story at Sunday school, which really stood out to me. It seemed like a simple story, but it had such a deep message when he said every week he would just talk about his week, meaning that he put his faith into action. And just in a week's worth of time, he would always have a lot to talk about in terms of bringing people together, diplomacy, peace treaties, working in remote places, putting feet to his faith, and then talking about that and drawing the connection between the Bible that he would teach and the work that he was doing, very important in his entire life, not just to say words, but to be a doer of those words. So seemed a very fitting way to start off as we talked throughout so many different parts of his life, through people who were significant in so many parts of his life, sharing all of the different facets of the former president And we look at the motorcade making its way to Joint Base Andrews Air Base that will bring on Special Mission Flight 39 back to Georgia for the private service in planes. Steve Ford, the son of President Gerald Ford, I thought was so touching. He said honesty was a part of Jimmy Carter's very soul, and to hear his father's words, especially at this time in our country, really was very, very significant. I think just from the perspective of being here at the cathedral, I'll tell you the moment where everyone teared up and laughed simultaneously was when Jason Carter was sharing the story of Papa, who would come to the door in his short shorts and his Crocs, and when he was learning how to use his new phone and called him by accident and said, "No, I'm not calling you, I'm taking a picture." I mean, the most relatable stories and those really special moments I thought was so touching. And then to see particularly Amy and Chip Carter in those moments, just kind of tears flowing, maybe a chance to take a deep breath and take in a long week of services, just felt the family deeply in that moment, in a personal connection they all felt with a man they said was just a regular guy who happened to be in the most powerful position in the world for 4 years.
Yeah, Jason describing those as 1970 shorts. And for those of us who were wearing those shorts in the 70s, that was a very vivid image.
It was personal for you?
It was.
Brought back memories for you? Yes. Yeah, that was really indicative of just how much he eschewed, the trappings of wealth and status. Jimmy Carter was not about that at all. As a matter of fact, he said he had no desire ever to be rich. He did not, after his presidency, he did not take advantage of presidential opportunities to make money, to make large sums of money from speeches, and to join corporate boards where he would make lots of money that way as well. He was not interested in doing that at all. I think
now, why do you think that
stands out. I think a lot of it had to do with his background, just where he came from.
But there have been a lot of presidents who have grown up without, who have morphed into these sort of regal figures. Richard Nixon grew up with very little, went to Whittier College, and he was one who became very, very regal.
His faith, his religious grounding, I think had a lot to do with how he saw the world, how he saw himself in the world. He really wanted to model his life after his Christian perspective of Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ was not a man about wealth and wanting to, achieve status and all of that. I think that was a large part of it.
Yeah,
he
President
really
Biden
took that to
talked
heart.
about that as well. Like President Biden talked about visiting President Carter in 2021, going to Plains, and just how modest of a home they had. And so I think for a lot of people who got to go to Plains and see it for themselves, it really was something to say, this is the president, former president, but living in this home that they've lived in for many years.
With linoleum flooring, and the Ziploc bags hanging by the kitchen.
You would see the living room where he watched the Braves in kind of a lazy boy recliner over the summers and spring into fall, and you would look at the paneled walls around him, things that were framed like Georgia maps and the kind of things that you would see in your grandparents' homes. That had been framed that that really showed that they were of a different generation.
This is unheard of today. This is not the world in which we live in. All the past presidents, Gerald Ford among them, who after his tenure in the White House did in fact take advantage of opportunities that come along.
Had a great home in Vail in Beaver Creek, Colorado, where he spent all of his summers.
Yeah, he lived a very comfortable life.
In Palm Springs in the winter.
And he had one term as well. But Carter, this is one of the reasons why Carter stands out. Though just 4 years in office, this is a man who, still put his feet to the fire. He got up every morning. He was a very, very disciplined man, disciplined long before he got into the military, but that, underscored the importance of discipline, the importance of getting up early, working hard. This was who President Carter was. He was not a showboat at all. He did the work.
And he was so multifaceted. Jeff, you talked about this over the few days that some people say he was a peanut farmer. But yes, I liked how President Biden talked about he also stood for civil rights. He was a Navy veteran, a nuclear engineer, a hardworking farmer that we mentioned, the president too. So it was great that you also could hear all these layers of who Jimmy Carter was. And I love that that was touched on today. Even though this was such a formal service, it still spoke to the humanity of a former president.
He had an insatiable appetite for learning, and whether he was learning how to be a woodworker who became the best at making furniture, or he was a tremendous fly fisherman. I hear stories about him in Habersham County with a fly rod in his hand where he was just absolutely a master.
He would practice how, now, you know, I've only seen, I don't know anything about fly fishing, so forgive me.
I know a little bit.
But you know, when you twirl the I don't even know what you call it, the casting, he would practice that on his own property. There's a pond there on his land, and he would practice that. I'm understanding. And you know, he made himself better.
That's right.
Better and better.
Or his
Just
artwork
practice.
over the Carter Center. You know, you look at his paintings, how wonderful they are. They're tremendous. Or he found great solace in writing poetry.
He was a poet, and he spoke Spanish. And as I've come to learn, he taught himself Spanish by reading the Spanish Bible. He read a page. He said he read a page of the Spanish Bible every day in order to teach himself how to speak Spanish. So this is a man like you. He was a constant, never-ending learner.
I want to bring in right now 11 Alive anchor Faith Jesse, who is joining us live in D.C. from the Capitol. Faith, even though this service happened in D.C., we certainly heard several Georgia ties.
That's right, Jonathan. We're here at the Capitol. 9 a.m. We saw those cannons blast before the motorcade slowly went to the cathedral. We do want to talk about some of those Georgia ties. One of the ones that stood out to me was that beautiful rendition of Amazing Grace performed by Phyllis Adams and Layla Bolden. Phyllis Adams is a Delta flight attendant who actually met the Carters back in 2017. She was a musical guest for Carter's Human Rights Defenders Forum. As she was asked to sing at the funeral, we can all remember that beautiful, beautiful performance that she did. Speaking of the Carter Center, there are so many representatives from the Atlanta headquarters here in D.C. As Jason was talking about in his speech, the Carter Center, those in Atlanta, just a small part of so many offices across the world, but really seeing the heartbeat of it here in D.C. Speaking of Jason, he was one of two grandchildren speaking at the podium, and I would say that, I mean, his speech was very memorable because it really painted Mr. Carter as a regular old grandpa, right? Somebody who he said would answer the door in Crocs. He gave the funny story about him mistakenly dialing him on his phone, saying that, what are you talking about? I'm not trying to call you. I'm trying to take a picture, something that many of us can really relate to. And I also thought it was notable when he said, sometimes I feel like I shared my grandfather with the world. This is one of those days, but he really shared the world with me and talked about just the memories of him and his children, going with who would be their great-grandfather and all of those experiences. I also like that he said, he talked about Mr. Carter's involvement with those tiny villages, those 600-person villages that he saw as home because he grew up in a small town like Plains. Another memorable Georgia tie that we all saw was Andy Young, who was, of course, Mr. Carter's ambassador to the UN during his administration. What was so notable about that was that Mr. Young, he spoke a couple of times, but that second time, it was a chair that he sat down next to the casket as two friends, as they would be tennis partners or just having lunch, would sit down and talk. And he spoke to the audience there, the service. He talked about how a story that many of us know, that when he first met Mr. Carter, when he first heard about him, he was a little skeptical of it. He says, it's still hard for me to understand how you can get to be president from Plains, Georgia, talking about how Plains in Sumter County was one of the meanest counties for those in the civil rights movement. And he says that changed after he saw the work of Mr. Carter, how he saw his heart and his light. I believe it was a time when they were at Pascal's and he went and spoke to every single person in the kitchen through the work that they've done, and that developed. And I thought that that was so symbolic of America and the civil rights movement and the what he said, the slave and the slave owner, right? Developing that relationship and really moving forward and really displaying that unity that we saw all through the week here at the Capitol, where I am right now, that congressional service where we saw people from both sides of the aisle come together, all of Washington really pause really take a moment to pause to remember the life and legacy of Mr. Carter, someone who was not really political. When you talk to lawmakers that I spoke with, Jack Watson, one of his chief of staff, his second chief of staff there in his last year of the White House, saying that, you know what, Mr. Carter wasn't political. He said Miss Rosalind Carter was a little bit more political and knew the ramifications of politics, but Mr. Carter, you know, he just made the decision that he felt was right for the people. And I think that's something that we saw this week with the lines of people that first night when the gates behind me opened here for the public to come and pay their respects. The lines of people standing in those below freezing temperatures, slush on the ground. It was not comfortable outside, but they stood there, they waited, and they were patiently waiting because they wanted the moment to go in there and say their final goodbyes to someone who they knew and loved, whether they knew him in person or just knew him as president, whether they were alive during the presidency or born after he left the White House and knew him for his humanitarian work. People were very touched by him, and I think that we saw that in that service. Of course, those in the service, family, dignitaries, people around the country coming there. It was a very emotional service inside of the cathedral, but also very emotional here on the streets where people line the streets to see Mr. Carter and that motorcade come through. So just a beautiful service, a lot of Atlanta ties, and of course the ultimate Georgia tie is going to be tonight when we see him take his final resting place back in his hometown of Plains.
So well said. I want to pick up on your observation regarding Ambassador Young and how he positioned himself right next to the casket there as he paid tribute to his dear, dear friend. They have such a long history, both of those gentlemen, President Carter and Ambassador Young, so active in the South, so active in the world. Championing human rights, championing justice and equality. Both of those men working together to advance humanity, to advance the idea that everybody deserves to be treated with respect and honor. And the fact that Ambassador Young spoke from his heart as he sat there next to his friend and talked about the life that he had lived and how he even was inspired by this great man. It really was quite an interesting, quite moving moment, a visual that I think I will not forget.
You know, of all the great lions that we have seen here in Atlanta in the civil rights movement and Jimmy Carter and all of these gifted people that we have been lucky enough to find ourselves in the company of, only Ambassador Young really is left.
Well, you know what? Here's the thing. We're looking at two Georgians right there in the center of this majestic cathedral, with one paying tribute to the other, both Ambassador Young, he himself a hero of the world.
And not just two Georgians, but two giants. I mean, we think about that, like that generation. We talk about, John Lewis, we talk about President Carter. There's only a handful of those people that we had here in Georgia, in Atlanta, that represent that era.
And those of us who live here in Georgia, I think I'm imagining, because this is how I feel, but I'm imagining those of us who live here in Georgia have a heightened sense of pride about honoring this man, the only president, of course, to come from the state of Georgia.
Well, we lived among them, whether it was Reverend Orange.
They know them differently.
Ralph David Abernathy, Reverend Orange, Hosea Williams, Reverend Lowry, and Andrew Young. I mean, the list goes on and on of these people that made such an incredible difference in the lives of all of us, whether we're black or white, or the trajectory of the country. All came out of Atlanta, and we took that for granted. You would go to a charity event, Brenda, as you know, and you would find yourself sitting next to these people, in their
great
company,
powerhouses,
and you're doing things like you're auctioning things with. I did a couple of events with Congressman Lewis where we're auctioning like trips to places, trying to raise some money, and nobody's paying any attention to us. But there has been, in their absence, I think there has been a sense of what they were, who they were, and how it's framed totally different as opposed to in the 1980s when they were among us, or the early 90s.
Yeah, you know, one of Carter's very good friends, Jimmy Carter and Rosalind had a second home up in the North Georgia mountains, and one of Carter's good friends who built that cabin up there in near Eulogies, he said this. He said of his friend Jimmy Carter, he's greater in every way than the people he walked among, but he never made any of us feel that way.
And that's something we heard from his grandson, Jason, in a previous interview. He talked about his grandfather knew he was a big deal, but didn't necessarily act like he was a big deal, which I think is. All right, with Cheryl Preheim, our Cheryl Preheim is there in D.C. Cheryl, we're watching as the motorcade is making its way toward Joint Base Andrews. You've been in D.C. for several days now. How beautiful to see just how many people have come out there to pay their respects.
You know, it's been impressive to say the least, because people from Washington, D.C., despite a snowstorm that kept kids out of school, were lining the street. But we met people from Seattle, from Pittsburgh, from parts of the West Coast. We saw people from all over the country who made the trip, despite the weather, to be part of the moment in history. They just felt compelled to come, and a number of those people also told us that over the years they had at one point or another gone to Plains, Georgia, because they wanted to sit down and hear the most famous Sunday school teacher in the world give a lesson as well. So I thought that was really telling as well, and I thought there was such a consistency of the number of people who came out from that very first moment, leaving Phoebe Sumter Medical Center in Americus, through Plains, at the Carter Center, then here to Washington, D.C. I think it really speaks to what President Carter was wanting this to be, and that would be something where the public would feel not only welcome, but that they were an integral part of this way to honor him. That was always such a benchmark of who he was and who he wanted to be, and we saw that on his inauguration day, where by surprise, at the prompting of his son Chip, he got out of the car and he and Rosalind, she in that beautiful bright green pea coat, walked down Pennsylvania Avenue as a visual symbol to the people that we are among you and we are relatable, and they certainly are. Salt of the earth would be such a fitting way to talk about both Jimmy and Rosalind, because you can't really talk about one without the other. So it was really special to hear those stories here from inside the church as well. Another, I think, really poignant moment was Garth Brooks and Trisha Yearwood singing Imagine. It was a beautiful rendition, simple with the guitar, and people may not know that the Carters really passed the baton to Garth Brooks and Trisha Yearwood for Habitat for Humanity, and for the last 12 or so years, that couple has been with the Carters on many builds, sort of this next generation. And we've heard that theme, I think, a lot in the service about what young people can take away from the lessons and the legacy that Jimmy Carter left behind. And number one on that is service, humanity, thinking of others over self, using positions of power, if you are fortunate enough to have one, for the greater good and not just for self and to build up ego or title or personal wealth, but to use those things for a greater good. So here on this day, a cold, windy day here in Washington, D.C., in front of the National Cathedral, as we watch that motorcade make its final stop to the flight that will take him back to Georgia for one final time. So much to reflect on, as we heard so many different people speaking, from a domestic advisor from the White House to the son of a former president and once rival, then deeply close friendship, to the grandchildren, and to the Honorable Ambassador Andrew Young. The thread that tied each of those together was the humanity of a man who impacted not only people around this country, but all around the world.
Not an empty seat in the House today, and people from both the Democratic and Republican Party and all in between. Not an empty seat. Everybody there to pay respect to this great man, and yet it really sort of underscores the significance of time, the passage of time. Because when President Carter left office, there were so many harsh critics of him and his presidency, and you know, he had a lot of trouble during his presidency, and there were lots of people who, even the Democratic Party was divided once he left office. But now, all these years later, decades later, after Carter ruffled so many feathers when he went to Washington, D.C. in his flannel shirts and carrying his own suitcase on board Air Force One, you know, there were lots of politicians, Tip O'Neill, House Speaker among them, who just felt like Carter just kind of rubbed the shine off of the luster of the presidency.
The Democrats ignored him at their conventions. They didn't want him to speak, or if he did, they gave him absolutely the worst time possible.
We're not supportive at all. Nope. We're happy to see him go. And all these years later, you know, it is amazing to see how you know, time changes things. Insight changes things. This was a very intellectual man. He was progressive, visionary, ahead of his time. Lots of people didn't understand, you know, what he was about or where he was coming from or why he did the things that he did. He was this man who brought a lot to the office that people didn't really count as important. And they certainly discounted him. You know, the visual persona was not in tune with the flannel shirt. The flannel shirt,
you're absolutely right.
Gave off a different air that was not reflective of who this man truly was at heart.
The video that we're seeing right now is one that sort of makes you think a little bit about President Carter in this sense, as we very seldom see President Carter surrounded by snow or framed by snow. But in 1976, there are the famous pictures of him traipsing in the snow in New Hampshire when New Hampshire was such an important primary, and it was sort of a make or break place for any nominee or prospective nominee. Or Iowa, which also was full of the peanut brigade as they were marching around in snow that was up to their waists. But this snow really makes you think of almost 50 years ago, really 50 years ago to the month, 49 years ago, when President Carter was just beginning to ascend with the primary season around the corner.
Yeah, you're looking live right now. In case you were just joining us, on the right, the motorcade making its way toward Joint Base Andrews. You can see those folks in formation, the troops ready there. We know from there they will depart Joint Base Andrews on Special Air Mission 39. We'll have a brief ceremony when his casket arrives there. The family will get back on the plane heading back here to Georgia for one final journey, which of course, as we've been reporting, will all end later this afternoon in the president's hometown of Plains, Georgia. And really special that we've been saying all during this coverage that this service started in Georgia, right near Plains, and it's going to end there. A lot of presidents choose not to be buried in their hometowns. I don't know if there are many that do, most at their libraries, but it's very significant that this will all end today in small town Plains, Georgia.
Which is appropriate because he remained the small town kind of guy. He's every man's president. He did not take on the trappings of anything other than who he actually was.
But he was also a pragmatist in this sense, that he was always looking forward, thinking ahead. Great concern from the Carter family about the future of Plains and that area in Sumter County. To get to Plains is an unusual place. You don't just roll through Plains on your way to somewhere else. Right. You have to seek out Plains to find it, whether it's from Columbus or from Macon. And there was great concern about the Carter family. The Carter Family Foundation has been very active with Habitat, trying to repair homes. They were sending money to make sure that these homes were taken care of before the Carters passed away. And there is concern about Plains. What does Plains look like 3, 5, 10 years from now? Well, the Carters are doing their part, even in perpetuity, in death. They are being buried there for people to come see them and to help buoy the community. In part, not entirely, it's why Jimmy Carter was also teaching Sunday school, granted his spirituality and his need to do that, but he was also doing that to help buoy the area economically, because, you know, so many people came to see and stay in the hotels, to eat in the restaurants, to, you know, lift this community, and he was doing that in any way he possibly could.
$4 million, it's estimated about $4 million every year that was poured into the Sumter County Plains area economy.
And it's not there anymore.
It's not there, but people will continue to come. The Carter property has been deeded to the National Park, Historic Park Service. The people will come for a while to pay tribute there where Rosalind and Jimmy Carter will be buried on his property. The long-term plan, now that property is deeded to the National Park Service, is to make a museum there. Whether or not that comes to fruition is yet to be seen, and how long people will continue to come to Maranatha Baptist Church, will continue to come to Plains. Your point is well made. Plains is out of the way. It's not an easy place to, I'll stop off at Plains on my way to. It's not that. And so, how long that area will be able to, garner additional visitors and, an economic boost as a result.
In the warmer months, you have the issue of the gnats and below the gnat line. And I think for a lot of Northerners, people that are not familiar with our part of the world, that's some destruction too. It's a challenge to spend time in Plains as you seek to get there, but the hope is that people will still come and honor this great family.
Cheryl, we're just a few minutes away from the motorcade arriving at Joint Base Andrews. What are you seeing from your vantage point?
The church is clearing out for the most part, but what I think is really interesting is how many people have not wanted to leave as we continue to see, things moving towards the air base for kind of the next phase after the cathedral service. What I can tell you is I in the distance from where I'm standing, I see a group from the Carter Center just spending time together, just people not really wanting to go. I think there's just a finality of the end of the service that you can feel with people here. It's interesting. I talked to someone yesterday inside the Capitol Rotunda who had worked with President Carter for many, many years, and she said that as she was standing in front of the casket and reading his quote on the wall about it is our duty, our obligation to do whatever we can for as long as we can with whatever we have to make a difference, she looked at that casket and she said, he did that. Every day that I knew him, he did that, and I want to do that too. And then she said, and then I could have sworn I heard his voice, like, keep it on time. That's what she said she heard in her mind, because he was a taskmaster too. He was efficient. He ran a tight ship, and so she said, I knew my time was up and I needed to move on. It was kind of a sweet story of just how much people are taking away from their time with him. Here in the nation's capital, so many people, it was like a family reunion of sorts. Yesterday, there were people that worked within his administration here in the White House. Some were very young when they joined his administration back in the day. Some had worked on his second campaign for governor in Georgia at the time, and they had wonderful stories about that. I don't know if anyone watching the service might have noticed, but each of the family members for the Carters was wearing a lapel pin, very significant. It was given to them by the Secret Service, and each pin had a gold center representing the Oval Office, and the outer ring was green, and a lot of people wondered what the significance of that. Well, green was the Carter campaign color. So there was care and love in each of the tiniest details that we saw throughout the day. I thought that meant a lot. Those will be wonderful mementos for the family to have. Each of them had one, from the youngest to the oldest. That moment when the family was following the horse-drawn caisson carrying the flag-draped casket, and the whole family, as a nod to the walk on Inauguration Day to the First Lady and President Carter, they walked behind that caisson, and the littlest one in the back looked to be about 4, and he just run through all his family members, and just really a visual symbol of the many generations of the Carters that were here in Washington, D.C. I had a chance to talk to Congresswoman Nikema Williams. She is, of course, over the 6th District, where 2 of President Carter's children currently live, and they spent a lot of time together while they were in D.C. and sharing some really sweet stories. But she said her takeaway from the time with the Carters is that even though the world knew that the end was near when he shared with us all that he was going to hospice about 2 years ago, it doesn't lessen the loss that they feel that he's no longer on this earth. They have just arrived at Joint Base Andrews as we're speaking, so we want to make sure to share with you that that leg has now started. But really, our thoughts with the Carter family, and we saw that emotion in the service, feeling the finality of this moment, and Jason Carter sharing that in those final days where he was with his grandfather when President Jimmy Carter said, I'm ready to see Rosalynn again. And I think many people who are close and connected to the Carters feel a great sense of comfort with the idea that they are reunited once again. They will be buried side by side under a willow tree right off the front porch on the longtime family property that Jason Carter shared such funny stories about. I laughed when he talked about drying out Ziploc bags on the fridge. I think that's incredibly relatable, especially some of us who've seen parents or grandparents do that, or talking about how long he had a phone with a cord connected to the wall or the wood paneling on the wall, but also something very sweet about a conscious decision to live simply so others could simply live. And that is something that he lived, and I think that is what draws people, whether you agreed with his politics or not, to have a great respect and admiration for the humanity of a man who lived his faith, not just every once in a while, but as Jason Carter said in his sharing inside the service, from the time he woke up till the time he laid his head, and he said he saw that every day of his grandfather's life. It says a lot when someone who knows you most intimately says that someone was absolutely the same person, whether a camera was on them or not. And I think that was telling too. So some observations here in Washington, D.C., as we have seen nothing but respect and admiration as we've talked to delegations from Georgia on both sides of the political aisle, even as we are a week and a half out from inauguration at a very divisive time in our country. Even in this moment in the nation's capital, President Jimmy Carter was bringing people together, and I think that is a powerful sentiment here at this particular time in our nation and in our world. Back to you.
Just a couple of weeks before the inauguration, a very busy Washington, D.C. right now, as preparations are also underway for the inauguration of President-elect Trump. You know, your points are well taken there, Cheryl. The word that comes to mind as we say goodbye to President Carter, this beautiful ceremony that we've just witnessed, and more ceremony to come in his home church. But the word that comes to mind is consistent. If nothing else, he was consistent. You always knew, pretty much, you could always guess where Jimmy Carter was going to land. It was all, and I've said this over and over, all of his decisions were rooted in principle. The principle of justice, the principle of respecting your fellow man, the principle of equality. All of his decisions were rooted in that. He was consistent. And his decisions were not based on convenience. He didn't make policy decisions. He didn't make decisions whether he was in office or not based on what was convenient at the time, what was politically convenient at the time. It did not matter. Stu Eisenstadt in the service today talked about how President Carter chose Paul Volcker to be head of the Federal Reserve. He knew that Volcker was going to raise interest rates in order to contain inflation, which was at a ridiculously all-time high. He knew that that was what was going to happen, but President Carter put him in that position anyway because he knew what the end result would be, and it was not a politically convenient thing to do. It was going to hurt him. In fact, it did. Interest rates came down, but they didn't come down until President Carter left office. And the benefit of the interest rate coming down went to Ronald Reagan, who succeeded President Carter. So he was consistent, and it didn't matter whether it hurt him or helped him. That was the man that he was.
Consistent through all of his life, not like you said, not just in politics, but throughout. I mean, I talked to some people who had worked for him for 40 plus years, and they said he was the same all through those years. People, and that's why I think he was able to keep some of those people with him throughout the journey at the Carter Center in Washington with Habitat, because they felt he was the same person and they knew who he was going to be. You're looking live right now, where we are just moments away from the president's motorcade and his casket arriving here at Joint Base Andrews. His remains will be transferred to the military aircraft that you have been watching, along with the family who will board Special Air Mission 39, making its way back here to Georgia, specifically Columbus, Georgia, before going down to Plains.
I want to add something here. This whole week has been in honor of this great man, and we've seen one service after another, one movement after another, very reflective of the stature that he represented. This great president. He did not always have a good life. When he left office, he was very depressed and trying to figure out what his next moves were going to be after his one term was over. In fact, when he got back home to Plains, he realized that he had to sell his peanut business because his business had fallen into default. It was $1 million in debt. And so he had to sell his business. In the midst of having lost this election, it was a landslide election, and he lost it tremendously, spectacularly. And now, what was he going to do? And he was relatively young. He was 56 or so, and relatively young. What was he going to do with the rest of his life? He had all of that to figure out, as well as selling his peanut business. It was not a comfortable time for him and Rosalynn.
Inauguration Day in 1981, I still remember. I remember Jimmy Carter wearing a raincoat, and it was a very, very bleak day in Georgia, and arriving in this state, and there were the stories about how the White House staff had tried to figure out what to get him. Initially, they were going to get him a vehicle, like a Jeep that he could run around in Plains. And instead, they opted for woodworking equipment, and they went to Sears and purchased a jigsaw for him, and that was going to be installed in the garage in Plains. And that's how he sort of spent his time initially, thinking, woodworking, getting better and better making things. And it's just typical Jimmy Carter.
Right. The eternal learner.
The eternal learner, but using it as a means to try to regroup and reload, if you will, and figure out what the future would hold for him. And that future would then be tied to a handshake at Emory University with President James Laney, who offered him an opportunity to come and speak. And that sort of evolved along with Ken Stein and all of that crowd into the Carter Center.
That was huge at the time, because here's this. Because he only served 4 years for the federal government, he didn't acquire a federal pension. He didn't earn a federal pension. He didn't have federal retirement. He didn't have health benefits, because he only worked for the government for 4 years. And so his health benefits came from working at Emory University as a professor.
I've really been struck, too, by how different this funeral is. It has a certain populism feel about it. And by that, I mean, oftentimes with men and women of great accomplishment who die, whether it's presidents or U.S. Supreme Court justices or senators or people that have had these high-profile, impactful lives. This one is different. He lived to be 100. There's nothing else to do. This is a life from beginning to middle to end is complete. Very seldom can we look at lives and say, wait, there was work to be done. He set or she set the course for others to follow. But for Jimmy Carter, it's different. He accomplished what he set out to do. He did it. His life is complete. And there is a celebration of that life in a way that we're not used to dealing with in funerals.
That's a good point, yeah.
It really is a fine point, which speaks to the hymn that I don't know whether the hymn has already been played or will be played once he gets to Georgia, but it is well with my soul. It is really sort of indicative of his full life, 100 years. It is well with my soul.
The departure ceremony getting started here in any moment, at any moment right here at Joint Base Andrews. You see the hearse, and the president's remains, as I mentioned, will be transferred to the military aircraft, followed by the family, and we will also hear shortly from the U.S. Air Force Band the music, "O Master, Let Me Walk With Thee," coming up here again before the flight arrives here in Columbus, Georgia, before traveling down to Plains where, as we mentioned, the final resting place will be for President Carter.
I love those great Christian anthems, those anthems that were penned back in the 19th century that just have this great resonance, that just feel like birth and life and death.
Which is what Jimmy Carter lived. I mean, he's sort of the walking the walking epitome of all of those beautiful anthems and hymns. And we heard some beautiful music today. The military chorus and orchestra, absolutely beautiful music that was performed in the service today. That setting just so perfect for the man that we are honoring, the man who lived such an extraordinary life. Though down to earth he was, the height of the cathedral, all of that space, the length of the corridor down which his casket was brought, all of that just huge majesty was really so perfect for this great man who lived a huge life.
But the contrast of what we'll see later today when he has his final service at Maranatha Baptist Church, a very small church.
Yes.
I don't know how many people it fits. It's not very many, right?
No, it's
about 400 people, I think, at most.
And that's squeezing them in.
And they squeezed in too.
And the other thing about that church is when you walk, it's like walking in a really old home. Like you hear it creak. It has such a feel that you would expect in that part of the world.
All right, we're going to pause now as the casket is being transferred to the aircraft. right, you're taking a live look here as the family, the Carter family boards Special Air Mission 39. We all watched as the president's casket was there loaded onto the aircraft before it now makes its way here to Georgia. It'll be arriving here within a couple hours in the Columbus, Georgia area, specifically at Lawson Army Field, and they'll have a ceremony there to arrive. But the president's final trip to Washington, D.C., we're watching.
His personal pastor will give the sermon of his life at Maranatha Baptist Church in a private service once the family and the casket arrive in planes. That service will happen at the beloved Maranatha Church, Baptist Church, where President Carter taught Sunday school every other Sunday, always planned his calendar, no matter what he was doing, as much as possible. He planned his calendar around his commitment to teaching Sunday school there at Maranatha. Every other Sunday, people would line up outside the doors at sunrise in order to get seats to hear the president speak Bible lessons. And people were coming from all over the country, sometimes from faraway places around the world, just to hear the president, to sit at his feet as he taught Bible lessons. And he would be very candid as he spoke to folks in the church there, talk about his week, as Jason told the audience today during the service. He would talk about the things that he had done during the course of that week. He would have a Bible lesson attached to it, and then when it was all over with, he would stay there and take pictures with whoever wanted to take a picture with the president once church service was over.
It was his longest job. His grandson Jason said out of any title he held, Sunday school teacher was the job he held the longest, and perhaps the one, other than being a grandfather, that he was most proud of.
Rightly so.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting as we see these live pictures, it makes you reflect, and it makes you reflect about how the South was seen by the rest of the United States before his election in 1976, and how it's been seen after. I've looked at some of the coverage from that night, and certainly I'm old enough to remember the coverage as a teenager watching it and all, but the view of the South was like it was another country, like it was some foreign capital, like Atlanta was treated in a way that, wow, nobody really seemingly knew a lot about Atlanta in 1976, at least nationally. We were just beginning to emerge in so many ways, whether it was with professional sports or Ted Turner buying the Braves around that time. The Atlanta that was Jimmy Carter's of that era was such a different place. I mean, it's just incredibly different as you think about its evolution in the years to come after Jimmy Carter.
Well, you know what? Your point is a good one, because it adds to the list of accomplishments of President Carter. All the many things that he did, they include bringing the South into the mainstream when it comes to people's view of the world. If it used to be, if it didn't happen in New York, or if it didn't happen in L.A., it didn't happen.
Yeah, anything west of the Hudson River was hinterland.
Right, and certainly south, right?
Right.
But President Carter really, his political career and his persona really stands as a bridge between the old South, old Southern politics, and the new South. And it speaks to his, whether consciously or unconsciously, his visionary point of view of the world.
Look,
he thought he was progressive. He thought forward. And look at, the South is very much on the map politically.
Think about Southern politicians before Jimmy Carter, whether it's Lester Maddox or John Stennis or George Wallace. I mean, you can go on and on about these sort of demagogues, for the most part, that represented, a very troubling time in America. After Jimmy Carter, the politics began to change, and the representation of the South began to change. With Jimmy Carter's ascension, there was an appreciation of Southern culture and Southern food, Southern music, the Allman Brothers, blues, Otis Redding, all of these kinds of music choices that were born here in the South. really got a second look in America.
President Carter just
He opened the door on a
He
lot.
opened the door on so many things, as you bring up these musicians and his love for jazz and blues and rock. The rock and roll president, as the documentary about President Carter speaks to so highly. Willie Nelson coming to the White House. I love the story of Willie Nelson going up on the roof of the White House. The story initially was they went up on the roof of the White House and did what Willie Nelson does.
With Chip Carter.
Yeah.
But the original story was that he went with a staff member of the White House.
We found out more.
Right. President Carter's biography, revealed the truth. He actually went with Chip up on the roof and smoked pot. President Carter just, he lived who he was with no apology at all. And Washington just had to deal with it. Washington wasn't on board with it at first. As I said, they felt like he just didn't bring enough gravitas and grandeur to the office of the presidency.
Or the curiosity the national press had with planes, or the rest of the country, the softball games that were going on, or Billy Carter, who was really smart and really eccentric and loved kind of poking the eye of the bear, as they say.
Billy Beer.
Billy and President Carter and Billy sitting in the gas station there in planes eating ribs, in a couple of recliners in a gas station. That wasn't done in America.
No president does that. No president does. Nope. Carter just he broke the veil on so many levels. He was one of a kind, and because of his very, very long life and very productive life, I doubt that we will see another like him.
No.
Certainly not in our lifetime, in this generation.
Yeah, I don't think so either. And we talk about a lifetime of service. What still strikes me is some of those images of him at 90 years old, 89 years old, still out there on those habitat bills. Who does that at that age?
Right.
And traveling to Haiti, traveling to Ghana, just the continual nature of what he did when he didn't have to. When you do so much for 20, 30, 40 years, but you continue to do it, that speaks to really who you are, not what you feel like you need to do.
I was also thinking about seeing him in the Braves clubhouse over the years, and baseball players are really, even as young men, they're all grizzled and just sort of sardonic and just sort of, nothing matters. But when Jimmy Carter would come in, it mattered, and everybody would just sort of have all of a sudden, yes, sir. And
which
wow,
is what he didn't want.
That's President Carter, for goodness
right,
sakes.
But he didn't want that, right? He just wanted to be, but President Carter, I want to say that, he lived kind of a dissonant life in some regards, because he wanted to be every man. He wanted to be just like you and me, just a regular guy. And he was anything but just a regular guy. He was absolutely extraordinary. Because he wore flannel shirts and cowboy boots, there were some, especially in Washington, who, did not count his intellectualism. But he was a very intellectual man.
I was always amazed
engineer.
At how much energy he always had. And by that, I mean, we would see him at these sporting events in Atlanta for years, whether it's the Hawks or the Braves or sitting down, getting ready to do the Falcons and Broncos game on the radio in Miami, and hey, look who's here, it's President Carter. And he was just everywhere something was going on. He was endlessly interested in all things that was happening in Atlanta, in Georgia. He was just that curiosity and that interest, whether it was sports or politics or habitat or helping people in need. It was just a curious soul that was insatiable.
And he would play along on the Kiss Cam. Whenever you would see him on the Kiss Cam, at the arenas, and people would, when they would see him and Rosalind pop up on the Kiss Cam, he'd play along. He'd give her a big kiss.
And all the time with Ted Turner too.
One of his very good friends.
Just. We're thinking about Ted Turner today as he is in the midst of rehabilitation and is not doing well health-wise. And I think for many of us Atlantans, Ted Turner and Jimmy Carter are forever linked, along with Andrew Young.
Absolutely.
Those three men were just, they made the quality of our lives here better.
Speaking of, as you get older, your health starts to fail. In 2015, President Carter diagnosed with brain cancer. And you know, I think most of us who heard that diagnosis from him, because he held a news conference, didn't expect him to live much longer. We thought
Well, we
were
mobilized
going to
here,
soon
didn't
say
we?
goodbye.
I mean, we
yes.
put together a funeral plan here at 11
As
Alive.
did every other media outlet.
I was dispatched to Plains for a couple of days, and we thought it would be the last time we ever saw him preach or teach Sunday school.
Yeah.
And
little did we know,
and
it's another 10 years.
I know
of his life
it was treated that Sunday almost like death. Like, this is the end. This is the end of something. Little did we know, it in many ways was the beginning.
Of just another phase.
Another chapter.
Of this extraordinary
of
man's life.
defeating another opponent, this time death.
He defied the odds.
A great contrarian.
Again.
Yeah.
Yes.
In a good way.
I will not die.
I'm not ready to go, St.
No,
Peter. I am not ready.
I had the opportunity to interview him while he was undergoing cancer treatment. And he was doing a habitat build at the age of 90 in Memphis. And you know, all of the reporters there were just in awe of this man who is running a buzzsaw. I don't know the official term of the piece of equipment, but I'm just going to say buzzsaw. And you're right, he was doing something with a saw and working very hard like everybody else on the build. And you know, in the back of your mind, you're looking at this 90-year-old man. It's like, wait a minute, you're trying to overcome brain cancer. He was undergoing, he had gone through elective surgery, he did radiation, he did had to agree to a bold and progressive immunotherapy, which is a lot more common now, but at the time was not. We know the treatment now was Keytruda, but he agreed to do that, and within a matter of weeks after this treatment, he was declared cancer-free. And I interviewed him and asked him about that, and he said, well, I'm feeling pretty good. Well, aren't you, tired from working that buzzsaw or whatever? We was just, well, I may have to soak a little bit when this is all over this evening. But he was undaunted. He would, if he committed to doing a habitat build or speaking somewhere or teaching Sunday school, if he was committed, he had put his word to it, he was going to be there.
Even when we saw him showing up at Rosalind's funeral, a lot of us were not sure if he would be well enough to attend, and there he goes, right there on the front row with his blanket. So
that was incredible.
He was determined, and he was going to be there.
He was true to
He was going to show up, and like we talked about before, at these habitat builds, he was working, not just the photo op, but he was present, and he was there, and he was working.
He had an undefeated spirit.
Yeah, his last habitat build was in Nashville, I believe, in October of 2015, and he had committed to that build in Nashville, but on the day, which was his birthday, the day he was supposed to be there, he had a fall in his home. And it was a very hard fall because he had to go to the hospital, and people were not sure in Nashville if he was going to be able to make it. And of course, they, knowing what had happened, would be forgiving if he didn't make it. But at the end of the day, he still showed up. He showed up with a black eye, swollen black eye, and a bandage over his brow. But he showed up there in a Braves baseball cap, sleeves rolled up, ready to work.
We're talking. This is such a big part of Jimmy Carter. People, the three of us are swapping stories here and tales and anecdotes, and everybody around Atlanta and Georgia has their own Jimmy Carter stories because he lived among us so much. In small stories just seem to pop to your head. For me, sitting here as I was looking at 747, I was thinking, Jimmy Carter was one of those guys that when he threw out the first pitch at a Braves game, so many celebrities, so many politicians, so many luminaries look foolish throwing a baseball. They just want to go out there and throw it. Jimmy Carter looked like he was
knew what he was doing.
He was playing catch with Smoltz or Glavine or Maddox. He knew what he was doing with a ball in his hand. He knew what he was doing all the time. He's one of those rare human beings who learned and had so many abilities to do such a myriad of things. I'm hard-pressed to think of anybody who could do as much or who did as much as Jimmy Carter did during his lifetime of unique skills, whether it's fly fishing or throwing a ball or writing poetry or art or woodworking. I mean, you pick it, he did it.
And he did it well.
also think it's been so great to see how during this state funeral he's included so many members of the Carter Center. We saw that in that first service. I know we saw a lot of them here at the cathedral today in Washington, and he really wanted to do that because I understand he wanted to say thank you to those people who really will be the ones now to continue on his legacy. They already have been, but now in his death, we know his grandson Jason Carter is among the trustees there, the leader. But I think that was very significant that he wanted to make sure those people were a part of this service, as they will really now be a part of the Carter Center that we will see in the future.
Yeah, that was a very gracious thing. The bar is high for all of those who are still here to carry on his legacy. But he has laid out the roadmap very clearly. They know what he wants, what he stands for, what his beliefs were, and how to function around the world. And so the Carter Center, though the bar is high, I think will continue very strongly in the legacy that President Carter has laid out for them, and will continue to promote peace, wage peace, and promote global health, advance democracy around the world, eradicate diseases. Those missions will continue. Even though he is now gone, he has left a lot of people with the roadmap, and he's left it in good hands.
I think the expectation of what the Carter Center would become, no one could possibly imagine. I always wonder if President and Mrs. Carter really knew that it would evolve in the way that it has. And I guess conversely, you know, when it was built and Ronald Reagan came here for the opening and all of that in 1985, those neighborhoods around the Carter Center were all dilapidated mostly. The old Fourth Ward was in serious duress, and Candler was in bad shape, and Inman Park was mostly deserted, and Ponce Highland was really rough, and the area along Ponce was a place you didn't want to mess around with after dark, after the Krispy Kreme, chasing some donuts. And you look at these neighborhoods now in the Renaissance and the renovation, the old Fourth Ward has some of the most costly real estate in the South. You can't get into Candler anymore unless you really have a big-time job, or Inman's homes are so cost prohibitive these days. You look at Ponce Highland, and you look at Ponce with the fancy new Chick-fil-A that's opening here in the days ahead. I mean, it's just incredible what's happened to the city, and the tie to the Carter Center. It's incredible there too.
It's perfect because
it is perfect,
wherever Jimmy Carter passed, he improved things.
It's like the old John Kenneth Galbraith line, The Economist, about a high tide lifts all ships.
Yeah. There you go. And that is exactly what Jimmy Carter did. That was his mission. That was his purpose. That's how he lived the rest of his life. And here again, I'm reminded. It's good to remember. This is a man who spent just 4 years in the White House, and yet the accomplishments are vast. The memories are vast.
It really is incredible. You're taking a live look right now, in case you're just joining us, here in Maryland, where right here at Joint Base Andrews, where we know Special Air Mission 39 will be taking off, headed toward Georgia any moment now. It'll land here in Georgia at Lawson Army Field in Fort Moore, right there in Columbus, where we know they'll have a arrival ceremony there before the motorcade makes its way to Maranatha Baptist Church, where it will all end with a special service this afternoon in Plains. Things running a little bit behind schedule, but we expect this will all, be maybe about 30 minutes behind. We're expecting now, as you can see on the screen, the funeral service in Plains to start around 5:15 this afternoon.
And this is sort of going a different path here, but again, we're sort of having these moments of electricity in our brain thinking about the Carters. But with the Carter Center was at a place in Atlanta when there was nowhere to eat. Your only options for the Carters to eat nearby would have been Manuel's. It was Babette's Cafe, which they used to frequent, which closed about a year and a half ago, or Wisteria. It was a place where there weren't many restaurants, or Everybody's, which has since closed, the pizza place that was right there on the turnabout at Emory, where you would see the Carters as well. But these were places we saw the Carters. We saw the Carters in Midtown and in town. We saw them in restaurants, and that was a time when the proliferation of restaurants in that area was, thin. But they were people that didn't just hide in the Carter Center, but they were always out. I mean, they were walking around, they were traveling around, they were in these communities, they were a part of these communities.
I'm sure they drove the Secret Service crazy.
Well, they had to. But you know, we would just see them all the time, and you know, when I moved here in the early '80s, I would have friends from Denver and my native Colorado would say, "Hey, you ever see the Carters?" And oh yeah, all the time. Well, what do you mean you see them all the time? Well, they're like in the restaurants, they're like at ball games, they're like in the studio here at the television station. We just see them all the time. They're available people.
They were.
You're taking a live look now as Special Air Mission 39 is leaving Maryland and making its way, as I mentioned, toward Georgia, where it will land here in a couple of hours in Columbus, Georgia. But what a very special service we saw earlier today at the National Cathedral, and the ceremony that we saw there as the plane gets ready to take off.
We saw for some time there the military personnel there standing at attention. It was a moment of silence here again, out of respect as President Carter makes his last departure from the Washington, D.C. area, as family and friends there on the tarmac, I should say friends on the tarmac, and those associates and the military personnel who paid their final respects there in Washington. It is a national day of mourning, as declared by President Joe Biden, who is wrapping up the final weeks of his presidency, who gave the eulogy today and spoke from what appeared to be really spoke from the heart, as Joe Biden is often known to do, praising President Carter, profusely thanking the Carter family for giving President Jimmy Carter and Rosalind Carter to the nation and to the world for the sacrifices that family members, his children, made because the parents were traveling here, there, and everywhere, doing good around the globe. And President Biden, as I watched, I was just curious, you know, what was going through his head? What were his thoughts about this great man? What was his thoughts about his own presidency, also a one-term president? And his thoughts about what he will do. He's a much older man than President Carter was when Carter left the office. Carter was a relatively young guy in his mid-50s. Joe Biden, you know, much older now. So, you know, I would imagine that Joe Biden is just thinking about his own legacy, what he leaves behind, what he has energy left to do. If anything, I would love to know, you know, what his thoughts and feelings were as he gave the eulogy today.
Fort Moore, of course, is named after Hal Moore, as various bases around the country changed names with a Confederate background from Fort Benning to Fort Moore.
Of course, you would know that piece of information. You are a walking encyclopedia.
If you have any time today, you want to Google Hal Moore and see this American life and this hero in Vietnam and his extraordinary military life, which in many ways, and this is saying something, is unrivaled in the history of this country. Yeah. And Hal Moore died recently, has not been dead very long, but his life is amazing, and his name now replacing Benning is certainly one of great honor.
You know, after we've talked about this all this week, the legacy of Carter's administration. He had very harsh critics during his administration and afterwards. But as time has passed, I am wondering and thinking perhaps that history will be much kinder to President Carter as we think about his many, many accomplishments and how forward-thinking he was when he held office, starting the Department of Education, advancing in the number of national parks. This man who forged peace between two strong warring nations between Israel and Egypt. So many more accomplishments. Started the Department of Energy when nobody was talking about alternative clean energy at the time.
One the Republicans can certainly agree on as well, and certainly with Jimmy Carter, is on deregulating the airline industry. Before Jimmy Carter, you had to be a wealthy person in this country to fly, and when everybody talks about, well, you know, it was a much different time flying, you were wearing a suit. Yeah, this was the 1% of America that was flying, and the rest of our families were either riding buses or taking trains.
Yeah.
All right. You were just taking a look at Joint Base Andrews, where Special Air Mission 39 is now taken off, making its way here to Georgia, Columbus, Georgia, before it arrives at Maranatha Baptist Church. We'll have more coverage in just a moment. Stay with us. And updates when the big story impacts your safety. Download the 11 Alive Plus app now, available on Roku, Fire, and Apple TV.
From inside Iran, from Israel, from Tampa, Hurricane Milton is here. Where we're standing right now is covered in water. Part of our continued reporting. Level increasing. Thanks for talking to me. Appreciate you.
Lead could be in your kid's school right now.
It's a potent neurotoxin for children.
But 11 Alive News uncovered most schools aren't testing for it, even though it's free.
Why are we having to convince facilities to protect kids?
We expose why most Georgia schools may be declining testing to avoid the results. 11 Alive News is holding schools accountable because your kid's safety shouldn't be optional. For solutions that protect your family, watch 11 Alive News. Stream this story free on 11 Alive Plus.
Good morning and welcome to Today. Nice to have you along with us.
Every day.
Star power is in the air.
Come on now.
Thank you for letting us impose.
Everything and everyone you're talking about. Only on Today.
I would never want any other family to have to go through what we've gone through.
This Georgia family lost their daughter after a crash into what they say was a faulty guardrail. 3 years later, our investigations led to a statewide inspection.
What did you guys find? Roughly about 1,400 that had installation issues.
GDOT also made changes to keep deficient guardrails off the road.
It was certainly based on conversations that we had with your team at 11.
For solutions that protect your safety, watch 11 Alive News. Stream this story free on 11 Alive Plus.
We know how much weather impacts your life, and some days are worse than others. 11 Alive weather impact alerts get you ready for all of it.
Very heavy rain out there right now.
When weather threatens to mess up your plans or even threatens your safety, 11 Alive News will immediately issue a weather impact alert, warning you about what's coming, the impact, and how you need to prepare.
It is very cold. Put your coat on this morning.
Weather impact.
Welcome back. We do want to get over to our other big story we are following today, which is the weather. We do have a weather impact alert. Meteorologist Melissa Nord standing by with more on this and school closings we've just learned about.
And Jonathan, in the last couple of hours, those school closings have been flooding in. So I'm going to list a couple of them off, but there is an entire breakdown and list on 11alive.com. A lot of schools are choosing to either close tomorrow or go to virtual learning days. Atlanta Public Schools closed tomorrow. Cobb, DeKalb, Gordon, Polk County is going to a remote learning day. Rockdale County remote as well. Paulding, Jackson, Griffin, Spalding. University of Georgia is even closing their campuses tomorrow. Henry Pickens, Bartow, Marietta City Schools, Douglas, Gwinnett has a digital learning day tomorrow, and new just in Fulton County is also saying they're going to have a remote learning day tomorrow. So a lot of schools taking the safe route tomorrow because there are still some uncertainties with how much snow, sleet, and freezing rain we can see, but better to play it safe than sorry with how much we're going to end up seeing out here. So Friday winter storm, we're tracking that. Accumulations likely north of the metro area of just snow in the metro, and for a lot of us, the forecast models today are leaning a little bit more towards a wintry mix. That means more icing risk that is increasing. So with that, you don't want to mess with travel. Travel gets more significantly impacted by ice than it does by sleet or snow out there. You can see we've got sunshine here in North Georgia right now. It's a cold, dry Arctic air day, but here is the winter storm in the southern plains right now. The cold side of this system is going to spread snowfall all the way up into the Ohio Valley. You can see in purple, these are winter weather advisories, and pink winter storm warnings all the way from the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex down to the state line. The National Weather Service here in Atlanta has a winter storm watch in effect. This will get upgraded within the next hour to 2 hours to a winter storm warning or winter weather advisory. Why they haven't upgraded that yet is because models run by run have been trending with more sleet and freezing rain and less in the way of snow. And they just want to get a concrete idea of realistically what we can be really looking like tomorrow before they decide who gets a warning and who gets an advisory. It's all considered an upgrade. We're going to see winter weather tomorrow. So precipitation types. Far north Georgia still looks like mostly snow. There will be some sleet towards the back side of things, but in the metro, now looks like we transition from snow into that wintry mix a little bit earlier in the afternoon, and it may be a situation where we end with a lot more freezing rain and less in the way of snow and sleet. Then south of I-20, you'll be starting with that mixture, sleet, some freezing rain, some snow in the morning, transitioning over into a cold rain by the finish of the event. So with that, this was our third call for snowfall map, updated at 9 o'clock last night. One more model run is coming in right now. We are going to put a new map out or finalize this tonight as we come in with the news as well. So 2 to